Go.
Welcome to Casual Politics, Douglas Carswell. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and I'm very grateful to you. You need no introduction. You were Conservative, actually member of Parliament for the Conservative Party from 2005 to 2014. And then since then you defected to UKIP. Exactly a year ago you defected to UKIP. So 1 year later, do you regret your decision that you defected to UKIP?
Absolutely not at all. I've never had more fun being an MP than now. I just slightly take issue with your use of the term defection. Defection would, I think, be an appropriate term if I had left one party and of my own volition joined another. But the truth is I actually did something that I don't think an MP's done for 50 or 60 years. I resigned and I asked permission from local people and they approved. So I think the term defection is a slightly pejorative term. I see this as changing from one party to another and getting an overwhelming mandate from local people to do it. I have no regrets whatsoever.
And your leader, Nigel Farage, he said that you still have a residual loyalty to the Conservative Party. Do you agree with him?
No, I have a residual loyalty to a lot more than just the Conservative Party. I have a residual loyalty to lots of people called Eurosceptics, and I have that loyalty to Eurosceptics in all sorts of parties. I have a staunch loyalty to Eurosceptics in the Labour Party, in the Green Party, in the Conservative Party, and in UKIP. After all, we're trying to make sure that Britain leaves the European Union. It's a corporatist racket, a con trick against the ordinary man and woman. We need to leave it, and so I'm loyally working with anyone in any party, and indeed in none, who shares the ambition of freeing this country from the European Brussels technocracy.
So why you and Nigel Farage, you're just supporting a different campaign group than your members of your party? Why is that?
I think from your question you're trying to trip me up, perhaps, maybe, on the fact that, if I may help you with your question, perhaps a slightly better way of putting it might be to say, Mr. Carswell, given that your party leader is backing one group campaigning for out, why are you backing another? Again, having helped you frame the question, I think I can frame the answer for you. The reason is very simple. The Electoral Commission will shortly decide which of the two groups gets official designated status. It makes sense to work with both groups until we know which one gets that status. Nigel, who leads the group of MEPs in the European Parliament, is working closely with one group. I, who lead UKIP in Westminster, am working very closely with Business for Britain. Together we'll make sure that we have close ties with whichever group gets that official status. It's not that difficult a concept to grasp.
But the campaign group that you're supporting hasn't made up its mind yet whether they will or not support actually Britain's membership within the European Union. But the campaign group that Mr. Farage is supporting, actually, they're already convinced that they're going to campaign to leave the European Union.
Well, I'm not sure I recognise that description at all. I mean, if you want to throw jibes and questions, you'll need to do a little better than that. Both groups are committed to trying to lead the Leave campaign. Both groups want to be officially designated as the official Leave group. I think it's a bit odd for you to frame a question that suggests that a group that wants to head the Leave group doesn't believe in leaving.
But one, it's depending on the Prime Minister's renegotiations, and one, it's not. So that's the difference, isn't it?
Well, with great respect, if you're trying to persuade people to support your view that we should leave the European Union, it's probably quite sensible to also take into account that a large number of people are looking to see what the Prime Minister comes back with. I wouldn't have thought that would be too difficult. I know that maybe in your training they teach you to be very sort of confrontational, but I think if you put questions to me that are based on a conflict that doesn't exist, it doesn't really shed a great deal of light on why, as UKIP's only MP, I might have the views I did. I mean, if I was interviewing UKIP's only MP for a student magazine, I might try and solicit questions that might explain a little bit about my philosophy, about how UKIP can win seats, about why UKIP might be a threat to the established political order. I think that might shed a bit more light on UKIP to your viewers than questions that are based on heat.
Because now it's Labour with Jeremy Corbyn that they posing threat to the establishment and not UKIP anymore. So I'm going to, one of the reasons that...
Is this Jeremy Corbyn with negative poll ratings?
Sorry?
Is this Jeremy Corbyn with negative poll ratings?
He won with a huge mandate. And
from a small, self-referential section of the electorate. But I think Mr. Corbyn is a great news for UKIP because I think he's unelectable. He has a strong mandate from a group that listens to that echo chamber called Twitter. The poll ratings that have come out recently show that he's in very negative territory, and this means that there's a wonderful opportunity for UKIP to represent ordinary working people. The Labour Party has lost touch with them. I'm not sure that Jeremy Corbyn's anti-patriotic, welfarist, pro-open borders agenda is going to really help win back those disaffected Labour voters. Great chance for UKIP. We're looking pretty good in the polling in Wales and London.
So don't you think that Jeremy Corbyn actually he's doing so far good because he won with a huge mandate more than the other leaders? So and some people they were saying that some of UKIP supporters that they were disaffected Labour supporters, they're going back to Labour. So you don't agree with this philosophy? You're losing actually rather than winning.
Well, I think there's some good empirical evidence to show that Comrade Corbyn is repelling Labour voters, and many of those voters are coming to UKIP.
British voters, not Labour voters.
Sorry?
British voters as a whole, but not because he won with a huge mandate.
Well, he won. I mean, you're almost beginning to sound like a Corbynist to yourself. Perhaps you are. But if you were to ask an objective question about the popularity of Corbyn, I think you could find quite clear evidence that yes, Comrade Corbyn is very popular amongst the comrades, but that small sectional interest of the hard left doesn't reflect the views of the British overall. Now, if you look at a very interesting set of data that appeared in the New Statesman, not my favourite magazine, but it produced some interesting data. It shows quite clearly that the voters that the Labour Party needs to win back have views on the free market much, much closer to UKIP's than to Comrade Corbyn's. But, I'm overjoyed. I'm absolutely thrilled that lefties are in favour of Comrade Corbyn and all that he stands for, because it makes the Labour Party unelectable and it makes it easier for UKIP to speak up for and represent working class people and to displace the Labour Party forever, hopefully.
But do you think that UKIP actually speaks up for the working class people with only one MP in Parliament?
I think with 4 million votes, Labour got 9 million votes, UKIP got 4 million. We're very well placed to displace the Labour Party entirely. If you look at the 1920s, when the Labour Party displaced the old Liberal Party, it started off gaining a good deal less than 4-to-9 ratio. By the end of the 1920s, the displacement had occurred. I think we're well on the way to seeing the displacement of the Labour Party by the Conservative Party, by UKIP, and the Conservative Party is offering a very different challenge to Labour in the southeast of England, to UKIP in the north of England, and to the SNP in Scotland. The Labour Party faces an existential problem. It's full of people that like to think of themselves as modern, yet they're wedded to a very old-fashioned, reactionary idea that a small elite knows what's best for the rest of us. I think in the age of the internet and of libertarian cultural norms, we will see the old Fabian socialist ideas discredited, and we're beginning to see this not just in Britain but on a much wider scale. And I think all the signs are that the Labour Party probably won't really exist in its current form in 10 or 15 years' time. I think that's a very good thing.
You mentioned 1920s, and the first Labour leader was Keir Hardie, and he formed a coalition with Liberals in order to form a government. And do you think that UKIP is able to form that coalition with other parties?
I wasn't aware that Keir Hardie had ever formed a coalition with the Liberals, but I'm happy to go back and check the history books, but I don't think it quite happened that way. I know that Keir Hardie certainly sat in Parliament, but the idea that he had formed a government with the Liberals was news to me. But I think the interesting thing about UKIP Yeah. I mean, I think the interesting thing about UKIP is that it offers something very distinctive. The Labour Party used to stand for the sectional interests of organised labour, as the name implies. Today, the Labour Party has an interest with one sectional group above all others, and that is the sectional interest of career politicians. It's out of touch with working people. It's out of touch with its base. It can be defeated in its own backyard, and I look forward to May's elections in Wales again, where I think that process of displacing and destroying socialism will continue.
First, when you stood as a member of parliament, it was for the Conservative Party, and now it's for UKIP. So what are the differences that you could really spot in parliament between you and your Conservative colleagues?
Well, I think there are quite a few differences. Most Conservative colleagues do most of the time what government whips tell them to do. They don't consider from points of principle or constituency interests how to vote. They do what their BlackBerry or their Apple message from the whip's office instructs them to do. The Conservatives also have an extraordinary ability to talk about free market economics and choice, but always ultimately to end up siding with big corporate interests. And we see this again and again. The party of Thatcher ends up actually being a party that believes in top-down control. UKIP, on the other hand, has a genuinely radically fresh approach to the economy. We want to make sure that the cartel bankers are no longer allowed to use crony capitalism to enrich themselves and buy huge assets subsidised by the rest of us. UKIP is a party that wants to break the energy cartel so that the big corporations that are currently ripping people off are no longer able to do that. UKIP wants to take on and challenge unaccountable concentrations of power in economics and politics. My old party, I'm afraid, is part of the cartel.
But you talked about actually whipping MPs, but how about rebels? Altogether, they rebelled more than 1,000 times against the government. Bill Cash, John Redwood, Richard Shepard is not an MP anymore. But why then you didn't join forces with the rebellious backbenchers in your Conservative Party?
Well, first of all, I would take issue with your use of the term a rebel. A rebel is someone who seeks to usurp illegitimate power. A rebel is someone who seeks to usurp legitimate power. There's nothing rebellious in that sense about an MP voting against the government whip. The reason we have MPs is precisely so that they can hold government and ministers to account. When an MP votes against their party, actually they're doing their job. That's why we have a parliament. Since the Civil War, it's been the job of those we elect to hold ministers to account. So having taken issue with your idea that they're rebels, I would say that on the contrary, I've worked very closely with MPs in all parties who've been prepared to defy their party whips and do the right thing. I did that in October 2011, I think it was, when I joined with 111 other MPs from all other parties in order to force David Cameron to move towards endorsing a referendum on our EU membership. Just the other day, I worked with a group of MPs, a cross-party basis, to force the government to backtrack on its attempts to fix the EU referendum. By working with a broad spectrum of MPs in all parties, we've been able to get David Cameron to back down on the wording of the referendum, on the date of the referendum, on the rules governing civil service conduct during the referendum. By working with other MPs who put the country first, we get our way. That's what MPs should do.
Don't you think that it's better to sit in on those green benches with this substantive power when you are part of that club of 321 MPs rather than just only one MP sitting on those green benches with no substantive power?
Well, when I was
isolated.
When I was a Conservative, I was one of 650 MPs. Short of cloning myself and standing in election in dozens of seats, I could not possibly be anything more than a single MP in a parliament of 650. So by definition, I have the same voting power now that I had previously. Unlike when I was a Conservative and I had to do what the government whips told me to do, now that I'm part of UKIP, I am free to think and argue and vote in accordance with my conscience. I would argue I have even greater influence and power. Not only that, being part of UKIP, I now get extra questions at Prime Minister's question time. I'm able to...
Not always.
I phrase my words deliberately. I get extra questions at Prime Minister's question time. That's not to say that I always get a question. I said I get extra questions. I get extra resources to do my job. I'm able to be, I think, far more effective as a UKIP MP than I ever was as a Conservative MP. And I think if you were to compare, for example, my record in terms of taking part in debates in the House of Commons, I've taken part in far more debates now. I get called to speak at the top of a debate rather than at the bottom of a debate. I think I have a far greater perch from which to lob things at ministers as a UKIP MP than I ever had as a Conservative backbencher.
You said that you...
Out of interest, would you be interviewing me for this magazine if I was still a Conservative backbencher? I think that proves my point.
And you said that your party at the election won a huge mandate by the British people, 4 million votes. But see, your leader didn't get elected as a member of parliament. It's like, for instance, let's say that if the Conservative government would have been elected as the governing party and not David Cameron as the leader, he would have lost his seat. So don't you think that this is really a huge mandate that you would call it?
So I don't understand your question. I've pointed out the fact that I won in Clacton. I pointed out the fact that we got
your leader
in 4
didn't
million.
get elected, even though that you won 4 million votes.
I've known that since the night of the election in May. What's your point?
That a party that wins 4 million votes, but without its leader being elected, it means that there is a problem.
Well, clearly there is a problem.
You could not convince the British people as a whole.
Well, clearly there is a problem that if you get 4 million votes and only one MP, that certainly is a problem. I would say there's a problem with the electoral system that cannot translate the wishes of 4 million people into democratic representation in the House of Commons. Let's remind you, for every 9 million votes that the Labour Party got, UKIP got 4 million. We got more votes than the SNP. We got 3 times more votes than the SNP, and yet there are 50-something members of the SNP in the Commons, only one UKIP. We got more votes than the Plaid Cymru, Ulster Unionists, Green Party, and the Liberal Democrats, all combined. And yet we've only got one MP. There is a problem, but I think that problem is not with the people who voted UKIP. It's with an outdated, monopolistic electoral system designed to preserve the privileges of the cartel in Westminster.
So do you think that it was because of the electoral system that Nigel Farage didn't win the seat?
I think it's clearly because of the electoral system that we had 4 million votes, but only one seat. It was, by definition, not a proportional system. Had it been truly proportional, we would have got 80-something MPs. I think I'm right in saying, according to Katie Ghosh from the Electoral Reform Society, that if it had been an STV-type system, we would have got 40 to 50. Now, quite clearly, there is a failure to translate the number of votes we got into seats, but I think the fault perhaps lies with an outdated monopolistic electoral system that is creation of the Victorians and was designed after the advent of mass democratic participation to allow political elites to control who it is that voters elected.
2 hypothetical questions now. The first one is that if Britain actually votes to leave the European Union, so in that case, UKIP would no longer be credible as a party. So will you join another party or form actually your own party?
I think, again, your question might betray your own views and say more about you than it could ever solicit from me. You imply that if the European issue is resolved and if we've freed ourselves from the tyranny of this unaccountable official... If people vote to leave the tyranny of this unaccountable bureaucracy in Brussels, we will certainly have fixed that problem with contemporary Britain, the nature of our relations with Europe. But there are many, many things wrong with this country that need fixing. Our relationship with the Brussels technocracy is only part of it. There are many other things that I think UKIP needs to focus on, many other things we need to change the country. I think we need a fundamental transformation in the distribution of power in this country. I think UKIP is at the cutting edge of radical changes in democracy and the calls for political reform. We're leading the calls for bank reform. All the other big parties policies, support the big cartel monetary system and the grossly unjust system of monetary policy that enriches the haves at the expense of the have-nots and allows those with assets to grow rich. We will call for further bank reforms. We believe in a whole range of economic and political reform besides leaving the European Union. There's so much wrong with this country. Fixing our relationship with Brussels is only part of it.
And the second one, once again, I know that you're going to say that it's my personal view, but if people,
it's helpful if you're it's helpful if you're trying to solicit an opinion from someone. If you try and address a question that's at least feigns subjectivity.
So that's why. They're all hypothetical questions in politics. So the second one is that if, again, British people, they vote to leave the European Union, do you think that there will be another referendum on the independence of Scotland?
Well, I suspect that if a majority of people in Scotland want a referendum in Scotland, there will be a referendum in Scotland. But I'm completely relaxed about this. In a democratic system, it should be for people to decide who governs.
But they already did last September.
Yeah, well, interview someone from Scotland and make that point to them. It's up to Scotland to decide these things, isn't it?
So again, if people they leave choose to leave the European Union, there will be another referendum held in a few years' time.
I strongly suspect that in 20 years' time, not only will this country be free from the European Union, but it will be a united kingdom with a federal devolved constitution of which Scotland has fiscal and self-governing autonomy as part of a united kingdom, and Scotland will be outside the European Union too. Mind you, I suspect that if things carry on like this, I think the Dutch are getting a referendum on EU membership soon. I suspect France will be outside the European Union. What we ought to be asking, and if one wants to be really progressive and cutting edge and original as a political thinker, I think you should be asking, what would a post-EU Europe look like? I suspect that many people today on the progressive left who believe that being Europe is internationalist and modern will shift their view quite profoundly. And I think what we need to do is to look to what Europe looks like after the end of this mid-20th century project and after it's not just failed but been seen to fail.
Do you think that refugee crisis, has it changed people's mind over Europe and Brussels?
Well, let's see. I mean, there are huge concerns in Europe about the failure of the political elite in Europe to handle this. I gather that there are elections and opinion polls you can look at in Europe, and I certainly suspect it will have an impact. But Britain is outside of Schengen. Thankfully, we're insulated from the folly of many of these mistakes by virtue of the fact we're outside Schengen. I suspect that Angela Merkel will find that she's created quite a domestic problem for herself with her stance, which I think has been irresponsible. If we want to address the crisis of people coming across the Mediterranean, tragically something like 4,000 people I think have drowned this year, we need to be prepared to stop the boats. Australia had a serious problem with illegal migrants landing on her shores. It's been now 18 months since boats landed on the coast of Australia. Why? Because Australia stopped the boats. In stopping the boats, they stopped the humanitarian disasters that were happening. If Europe is serious about stopping these disasters and stopping the mass movement of people across the Mediterranean, it needs to stop the boats. But unfortunately, because of the poor quality of the calibre of the leadership in Europe, they're still grasping around for answers to problems that they have made worse.
As your leader is proposing, do you think that an Australian point system will work in this country?
Yes.
Why?
Oh, because Australia can control who wants to go to Australia. Like Australia, we're an island. Like
but
Australia,
people will come to your country.
if you have an Australian type points-based system, you can decide who comes and who doesn't come. And if people come in without the right to come, they're removed. If you look at Australia, the points-based system means that every year Australia has a discussion over how many work visas to issue. Australia, I think, recently announced that they were going to allow 12,000 Syrian migrants, asylum seekers, I should say, the right to move to Australia. They have a very generous system of providing political asylum to people who need it. But equally, Australia doesn't find, like Britain, that they have no control over these matters. Something like, I think 670,000 people came into this country last year. And because we're in the European Union, we can't control that. We have no control over our borders. So I think not only do we need the Australian type system, if you look at it another way, most countries around the world are able to control who comes in. Switzerland can control who comes in. Norway can control who comes in. America, if you go... Well, I'm not sure that the size of the country has any... Yes, it's a small country.
So it's easier to control who's coming and who's going out.
Well, I think Canada controls. Australia's a pretty big country. They can control. I'm not sure your hypothesis that the size of a country determines the effectiveness with which you can control your borders really holds. China's quite a big country. I think they have a pretty rigid approach to who comes in and who doesn't come in. Most countries around the world, you've got to remember, 93% of the world's population lives outside the European Union. Overwhelmingly, most countries control who does go in and does not go into their country. We just want the right to control who comes in here and have a democratically accountable parliament that can say no, so that when we get large numbers of people coming in here, we can say, with great respect, thanks but no thanks.
Was Britain right to accept 20,000 refugees to come to this country over the next 5 years?
I think that's broadly right. There are some people... Well, there are some people who would say we should accept more. There are some people who say we should accept fewer. I think that's broadly about right. But the important thing is that we reduce immigration. It's really important that we cut immigration into this country. We can no longer continue to accept 670,000 people. But if you reduce the total number of immigrants coming into the country, you can at the same time be generous in terms of allowing asylum seekers. We allowed something like, I think, 12,000 asylum seekers into this country last year, out of a total of 670,000 total migrants. So I look to cut immigration, but at the same time, I think you can still be compassionate for those who need it.
And over the last few months, do you think that politics has become more nasty and more unfair to leaders? We saw with Jeremy Corbyn actually, and metropolitan press, they criticize more his personality than his policies, and they should rather focus on his policies than personality. And we saw last week with David Cameron and the pig. So do you think that that is unfair?
I certainly think the boundaries between reporting on politics and commenting have become a little blurred. I certainly think that some people who are positing as journalists have actually ended up expressing views and showing that they are players rather than neutral observers. I also think that perhaps some, particularly on the left, have become actually quite close-minded and quite insular. But you know, the narrower and more short-sighted that the left becomes, the better, because you know, I'm in politics not just to try and get Britain outside of the European Union. I very much want to see the destruction of Fabianism, and I think the narcissism of the left makes it much easier to ensure that actually the left is displaced totally by something radically different.
But do you think that this way of doing politics will bring more people actually into politics, as we saw with Jeremy Corbyn, thousands of students registered to vote? Do you think that this way of politics will work?
I've been I wrote a book called The End of Politics and the Birth of Our Democracy, a book that I'm sure you researched well in order to get a sense of what I believed before you came and asked me these questions. And as I'm sure you would have discovered from reading the book The End of Politics and the Birth of Our Democracy, I suggest that the established way of doing politics is coming to an end, and that the internet allows us to reconnect with the grassroots and to bring in people in new forms of membership and new forms of candidate selection. And I think that's very, very exciting and something that is happening. But the interesting thing is, as the left in this country becomes more democratic and more controlled by its members, it necessarily becomes less electable. As the centre-right becomes more democratic, it becomes far more in tune with what people want and becomes far more electable. The democratisation of politics and the democratisation of political comment in this country means, I think, that we will get this inevitable shift towards a free market libertarianism and away from old-fashioned, out-of-date ideas of the British left.
Is it because of the education as well that there are more educated people than there used to be in the past?
I'm not sure that that necessarily holds. I think the main driver of this is the democratisation of comment. In the past, it was The Guardian and a leftist elite who decided what were the parameters of acceptable debate. Now we have wonderful websites like Forbes, and they're accountable to their readers every day.
And two last questions. I know that you're in a rush. The first one is that your party donor said that if you don't support his campaign, then he will suggest to diselect you as member of parliament for Rochester. And so do you think that is that fair to you, who gained so far 2 seats out of 3 seats for UKIP?
Well, first, I'm not the MP for Rochester, I'm the MP for Clacton. Secondly, it's for Aaron Banks to justify what Aaron Banks said. I've responded to it quite a bit over the past 48 hours, and I'm not really going to add anything further. Sometimes in politics you get people who have all sorts of thoughts and advice on how to do politics, and I'm very grateful for their thoughts and their advice, but I don't always take their thoughts and advice, and I particularly don't take their thoughts and advice if they don't themselves have a track record of winning elections. But it's always helpful to have those thoughts and advice, and I treat them with the regard that they deserve.
And my last question is that what will be the role of Douglas Carswell in order to hold to account the government over the next 5 years?
I'll do what I think I've been doing for a number of years now, which is voting against ministers when they are foolish, and trying to pass draconian laws that are illiberal, when they try and fritter away our money, and when they accept the groupthink that is prevalent in Westminster and Whitehall, which has done this country no good. I'll continue to be outspoken and independent-minded, and I'm 100% part of UKIP, absolutely loving my job and looking forward to the referendum that I hope will free us from the bureaucracy and the remote elite in Brussels.
We shall wait and see. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Great.